In this tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through the basic settings of a DSLR or mirrorless camera so that you can feel more confident in approaching different styles of photography, be it for personal use on social media posts, family portraits, or professional images, including product still life, architectural interiors, and urban landscapes. If you have an iPhone or Android phone and a third-party app such as Manual, then you can follow along as all of the concepts and settings that I'll be covering in this video can be applied when you're using your phone as a camera. I've been shooting a broad range of subject matter for the past 15 years in my digital production company, and as I introduce you to some of the camera settings, I'll share with you some of my insights into what it takes to get that perfect shot no matter what you're shooting. What I'm covering today will encompass the basic principles of photography, so you can follow along no matter what camera you have. I'm going to be demonstrating on my Canon EOS R, which is currently shooting this opening scene, and also my Canon 5D Mark III camera. The EOS R is one of the newer generation of full-frame mirrorless cameras, which has many advantages, including the fact that it's more compact and also includes a flip-out touchscreen that is not only super convenient for focusing and monitoring your still images, but really comes into its own when you're shooting video. For this tutorial, I'm going to stick with still photography, but many of the principles that I'll be discussing will also apply to video production. So without any further delay, let's get started. The first thing I want to cover off is lens choice. Now, when you purchase your DSLR or mirrorless camera, you usually get it with a kit lens, which will have a certain focal length range. It's generally anywhere from 16 to 35 or 24 to 80 or even 24 to 135. So what that actually represents is a range of focal lengths that you can select for different styles of shooting. Now, if you have the budget, you can also get those focal lengths as prime lenses. For example, I've got a 17mm tilt shift lens here for architectural photography, 50mm portrait, an 85mm, and a 135. And I've also got a 70-300. So when it comes to selecting the right focal length, it's going to depend on the type of shot you're looking for. For example, if you're shooting an architectural interior, that's going to be a wide shot. So that will require a 17mm lens or perhaps 24. If I'm shooting a portrait, I might want to select a 50mm lens or 85 or 135. Now, the advantage of going to the 85 or 135 focal length is that you get a more flattering look for your subject matter, and you're also able to push the background out further and isolate the subject matter from the background for a really nice portrait effect. If you're wanting to capture close-up shots of plants, food photography, or products, then a macro lens might be the way to go. The Canon EF 100 f2.8L macro lens is one of the most popular, offering a 1:1 magnification. But you don't always need a dedicated macro lens to get great close-up shots. Some zoom lenses have a macro feature which can shoot at 0.5 magnification, which means you can get a nice close-up macro shot without using a dedicated macro lens. For example, this 35mm 1.8 RF lens that I got with my EOS R has a 0.5 magnification, which allows me to get up as close as 17 centimeters away from the subject, resulting in these close-up images. So the choice of lens depends on the type of subject you're shooting. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated to understand focal lengths depending on which camera you have. So when I was referring to those focal lengths, I was applying them to a full frame camera, such as the 5D Mark III or the EOS R. Now, if you have one of the more budget-oriented cameras from Canon or any other manufacturer, they generally have an APS-C sensor rather than full frame. And that means that you have to apply a magnification on the lens to get the correct focal length. So for example, if you have an APS-C sensor camera and you have a 50mm lens, you need to apply a 1.6 or 1.5 magnification. So the 50mm lens essentially becomes a 75mm lens, or a 16mm lens becomes 24mm. So there is quite a bit of difference there, and that really comes into play and becomes noticeable especially when you're shooting architectural interiors. So for those of you more interested in architecture, certainly having a full frame sensor is going to be of an advantage because you get the full benefit of the width of the 16mm focal length. If you are applying magnification, it's less wide, so you get less in the frame. When it comes to micro four thirds cameras, there's even more of magnification. You need to apply a 2x factor. So that means that a 16mm lens is around 32, so it acts more like a 35mm wide angle lens, or a 50mm lens will essentially act as a 100mm lens. So quite a massive difference when you're shooting in micro four thirds. Now, it's not necessarily a disadvantage, you just have to be aware of those magnification factors so that you can apply the appropriate focal length. So that's a quick overview on how to select the most appropriate lens depending on the type of shot you're taking. The next thing I wanted to talk about is resolution. Now, when you purchase your camera, you're probably already aware that it has a certain resolution, and obviously the higher the better. But you can go in and change that resolution to lower settings if you want a smaller file size that makes it more convenient to transfer your images over Wi-Fi, for example, and share them very quickly on social media. But generally, if you're going to the trouble to shoot on a high-end camera, you want to shoot it at the highest possible setting. So you'd leave it on the maximum setting. But there's one other choice that you need to be aware of, and that is whether you're going to shoot in RAW or JPEG. JPEG is a smaller file size, so it's a little bit more convenient. But if you shoot in RAW, RAW generally gives you more latitude in correcting the exposure, anywhere up to 8 or 12 stops, whereas a JPEG image can only be adjusted by 1 or 2 stops. So what that means is that if you've taken a photo where you've underexposed it by more than 2 stops, if you had have shot it in RAW, you'll be able to recover that underexposed area and bring the detail out of the shadow for an even exposure. So it can be a real lifesaver if you've made mistakes. And even if you do have the perfect exposure, having the RAW image just lets you get right into the detail and finesse it even further in post-production. So I generally recommend shooting in RAW for the ultimate image quality. The next thing I want to talk about are the 3 settings that you need to master in order to get the perfect exposure every time. And these 3 basic settings are applicable to all cameras, and also, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a manual photo app on an iPhone or Android device, understanding these principles will help you get the right exposure. The first one I want to talk about is ISO, and that has to do with the sensitivity of light into the sensor. So when you're selecting the ISO, it's going to be dependent on the amount of available light that you have. So if you're shooting outside in broad daylight, 100 ISO, which is generally the lowest setting, is more than adequate. If you're shooting at lower lighting circumstances late at night or early in the morning, you might have to bump the ISO up to around 800 in order to get the right exposure. If you're shooting in very low light circumstances, you might need to increase it to 1600 or 3200 or even higher. Now, if you have a very recent DSLR or mirrorless camera, then you'll be able to shoot at least 1600 or 3200 with very minimal noise. But for older cameras, if you select too high an ISO, sometimes you introduce far too much noise that can't be cleaned up in post-production. So you need to be aware of that before making the selection. The next setting to be aware of is your aperture. The aperture refers to the amount of light that you're allowing in the lens. So for example, if I take this 50mm 1.2 lens, it has an aperture range from 1.2 to f16. At 1.2, the aperture is fully open, which means it allows the most amount of light through the lens to pass through to the sensor. And at 16, it has the smallest aperture, which allows only a minimal amount of light. So if I'm shooting late at night, outdoors, I'm very likely to use a wide open aperture in order to allow the most amount of light. If I'm shooting outdoor in mid daylight or indoors with sufficient lighting, I would choose a mid-range aperture from 5.6 to 8 or maybe f11. So it really depends on how much lighting you have available. But aperture doesn't only refer to the amount of light you're allowing to pass through the lens to the sensor. It also has a significant effect on how much focus is on objects within your scene, which is called the depth of field. So if you open your aperture to 1.2, you're going to have what we call a shallow depth of field, where your main subject will be in focus, but everything in front of it and behind it will be out of focus. And that can give you quite a creative look in your image and is very well suited to portraits when you're using 50mm or 85mm lenses, for example. Now, the opposite is true of using a smaller aperture. If you choose f11 through to f16, then all of the items or objects in that scene are going to be in focus, and that's ideally suited to when you're shooting architectural interiors, for example. The final thing I want to take a look at is shutter speed, and as the name implies, the shutter speed determines how fast the shutter opens and closes to allow light to pass through the sensor. So if you're shooting action photography, generally you want a higher shutter speed, provided that you're outdoors with ample light. Then you can select a shutter speed anywhere up to 1/250th or 1/500th of a second, or sometimes even faster. If you're shooting in lower lighting conditions, you might need a slower shutter speed, such as 1/60th. Now, if you go below 1/60th of a second, you'll introduce camera shake. So you need to put your camera on a tripod in order to stabilize the shot. Now, when it comes to getting the correct exposure, you can take advantage of aperture priority and shutter priority modes. So that means that when you choose either your aperture or shutter speed, the corresponding setting is selected for you automatically by the camera. Or you can go into full manual mode, where you can select the aperture and shutter speed and work out the correct setting using the built-in light meter reading of the camera. So that's all I wanted to cover off on today. Some of the basics that you need to know in order to get the most out of your camera. Hopefully you found this information useful. If you did, hit me up with a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you'll be notified of up and coming video releases. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments box below. See you on the next one. Bye for now.